So you guys don't have to watch Laid Back History tomorrow, because this is it. So if you want to watch it again, you're more than welcome to. But this is, I just thought, you know what, if I'm going to go ahead and be doing this talk, I haven't done it for Laid Back History yet, so why not record it and just use it? So I'm wondering, can we flip off the lights a little bit, though? That might, maybe that'll help. Nope. Or is that the fan? Oh, there we go.
Perfect.
How's that? Is that a little better? Okay. So what we're going to be talking about today is we're going to talk about actually Diggers, the National Geographic show that I was lucky enough to work on. I was there for 2 years. Actually helped get the show started somewhat. They were having some issues trying to get it going. The show was about metal detecting, and there was this idea that metal detecting was bad because they steal history. And we were trying to convince historic sites that we were going to do things right, that we were actually going to have an archaeologist on site, and we were going to catalog everything, and whoever owned the property could have it. You know, we weren't taking anything. And so I was contacted by the producer of the show, John Jones, and John asked, he wanted to do something on the Whiskey Rebellion. And so he called several people, and they all kept saying, well, talk to Clay. And it was funny because a couple of them didn't know my last name, they just knew Clay. So he eventually figured out who Clay was, and he came and visited, and we talked a little bit. And I said, you know, John, I'd love to be involved with this, but again, you know, the connotations with metal detecting. How about if I get a buddy of mine who's an archaeologist involved? And John was very happy about that. So Bryan Cunning, who a lot of you know, if you've watched Laid Back History, you've seen Bryan. A good friend of mine, he's an archaeologist. And so I brought him in, and he met John. And John was just, he liked our banter back and forth. So kind of liked how we joked around with each other, and we had a good time. And so we ended up helping get the first episode on the Whiskey Rebellion done. And we found the sites for them, we secured the sites for them, and then we ended up being on air as the historian and an archaeologist, and that led to working and helping with the show for another couple seasons for myself. Bryan was the supervising archaeologist, I think, for all 4 seasons after that. So it was nice. It was great to be involved with it, and took advantage of the fact that we were involved with the show to get them to come here to Washington a couple times. So not only did they film the Whiskey Rebellion episode, they filmed one on Frontier Forts. They actually filmed some stuff on Route 40, but we actually never produced the episode. And then we did one on Braddock's expedition. And during that particular one, that episode, we found one of Braddock's camps, Bear Camp. Now, since that time, we've realized that we didn't find it. We found an offshoot of the camp. The camp was a little bit on top of the hill, but even still, we found a historic site that no one knew was there. And so this program is based on that show, on Diggers. And so Digging for the Whiskey Rebellion, it was that first episode where we went to Whiskey Rebellion sites to try to find the history of the Whiskey Rebellion. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go quickly through. I mean, you guys know about the Whiskey Rebellion. I've probably talked about it here before. If you've watched any Laid Back Histories, I've talked about it there. We have the Whiskey Rebellion Festival each year where we tell the history of it. So I know you know the history, but I'm going to just do a brief, cover it just really briefly, and then talk about a couple of the sites we went to and some of the things that we found. So the Whiskey Rebellion, what is it? I think we pretty much know that. It was the rebellion that broke out here in western Pennsylvania, starting really in 1791 and going through 1794. And there's a lot of reasons behind the Whiskey Rebellion, but the one that really affected us was an excise tax on distilled spirits. So farmers out here grew a lot of rye. They would take that rye, they would create a mash out of it, then they would distill that down into rye whiskey. For a couple reasons. One, it made it a lot easier to transport. Transporting big bushels of rye it takes up a lot of space, and trying to get that over the mountains when there's no road to connect the east and the west, except for Braddock's Road, which was not really built to be a permanent road, it was difficult to transport that. And so the farmers realized that they could distill rye whiskey, and they could take a lot more of their product over the mountains at one time, and they were getting a higher price for it. So per gallon, they were getting about 28 to 35 cents, depending on where it was being sold. Well, an excise tax was put on distilled spirits. That tax was a little bit different than what we're used to today. When we think of taxes today, we go buy a bag of chips. See, came in handy. Thanks for the props. We go buy a bag of chips. And when we buy it, we pay a tax on top of the price of it. Well, the way the the excise tax worked was that the tax was on the production of whiskey. So if I had a distillery, for each gallon of whiskey I distilled, I'd have to pay a tax. And that tax worked out to be about 6 to 7 cents a gallon. Which doesn't seem like a lot until you realize that whiskey was worth about 28 cents a gallon. So if you take 7 cents and 28 cents, you're looking at about a 25% tax. That is a very high tax. You also have farmers who are not, they really don't have a lot of currency to where they can pay the tax. The government wants to be paid in physical money. Well, out here in Western Pennsylvania, mainly what we did was barter. You do not see a lot of physical currency at that time being used. And so the farmers didn't have the money to pay the tax. There's another problem with it. They're charging the tax. They're basically doing a distilling period of all year. So what ends up happening is the tax collectors come out here initially. They try to collect the tax. They find out that it's very difficult to do because there's a lot of distillers out here. We don't have big distilleries like what they do back out east. I don't know which way is east, but we're going to act like it's that way. We don't have big distilleries like they do back out east, but we have a lot of distilleries. I may have a small pot still that, it's a 5 or 6 gallon pot still. Now back out east, they may have 40, 50 gallon stills and have 2 or 3 of them. So they're distilling a lot of whiskey out there. But when the tax collectors get out here and they realize how many stills there are, they find it very difficult to collect the tax. How can they possibly get around to each one of those stills every month and see how much whiskey has been distilled and collect the tax? So instead what they decide to do is they register the stills. So they come out, they look at your still, they measure it, they figure out the capacity of it, and that's how you are registered. So you're registered based on the capacity. So really what you could produce over the course of 1 month. So my still is capable of producing 10 gallons. That's how I'm registered. Now, the tax collector, if he doesn't get around every month, it's no big deal. He can come back at 4 months, look and say, okay, you're registered at 10 gallons. It's been 4 months since I've collected it. You owe me for 40 gallons of whiskey. Now, if that same time period I distilled 20 gallons, didn't matter. He wasn't collecting it on what I made. He collected it on what I could have made. Now, the argument for that when the farmers complained is the government said, well, you could make more. You could just go ahead and make more, but they were basing that capacity on really the limit of what your still could do. So very few farmers were able to capitalize and make more whiskey than what their still was registered at. And so the farmers decided to rebel against them. So you have a couple things. You have the tax. You have the tariff on goods going down the Mississippi River. You have the lack of a road to connect the east and the west. And you have distrust of a government. The farmers out here had just, a lot of them fought in the war to separate from England, from Great Britain. And now they're being subjugated by another government that they didn't trust. And so a lot of them just didn't trust the government and they were trying to get away from it. So they rebelled because of that. And so when you look at the insurrection, there's Alexander Hamilton. Normally when I say that I expect a boo, but that's okay. So Alexander Hamilton is the one that came up with the excise tax. And I think I accidentally left that in. That's the Frontier Forts. That's from a different talk. I think I'm just going to say that I accidentally left that in there. So, from another talk. But you have farmers that are rebelling, but you do have several men that are leaders of this rebellion. Prominent men that are leaders of it. You have David Bradford, you have Albert Gallatin, and you have John Holcroft. David Bradford was, his home's right down the street from here, not too far away. David was extremely wealthy. He himself was not a distiller. He was at one time our representative in the state government. He was the Deputy Attorney General of Washington County. He was a lawyer. He was a businessman. And he was not affected by the tax. But he did disagree with it. He thought it was an unjust tax. He thought it was an unconstitutional tax because of the way that the tax was worked out. It wasn't an equal tax throughout the country. And a tax by our Constitution, any tax that's levied by our government has to be equal throughout the country. And this one, in his mind, wasn't. And so he takes on more of a vocal role in the rebellion, in that he is voicing the displeasure of the farmers when he travels back out east. Albert Gallatin is kind of the same thing. This is another very wealthy man, a well-known politician who is against the tax. And he is as well voicing his displeasure back out east. And then you have John Holcroft, nicknamed Tom the Tinker. John Holcroft was the violent leader of the rebellion. He felt the only way to get the farmers' point across and to get the government to listen to them was through violence. So a lot of what John did was protesting, marches, raising liberty poles, tarring and feathering, stoning tax collectors, as you do. But you have, the Tarn Featherings were a way of intimidating the tax collectors. But it was also a way of saying to the government, we're not going to pay the tax. And if you send other tax collectors out, we will tar and feather them. They threatened to burn down the homes of a couple tax collectors. In fact, in 1794, they would live up to that threat and burn down the home of Benjamin Wells, who was a tax collector. He lived in Connellsville. And so John Holcroft is kind of blamed for most of the violence of the rebellion. In fact, he takes on this kind of mythical standing in that anything that happens that is violent, it's Tom the Tinker did that. And there could be something that happened in Washington at 2 o'clock in the afternoon and something that happened in Pittsburgh at 2:05 in the afternoon, and it was both Tom the Tinker. Didn't matter that he couldn't travel that fast. Somehow he made it. So they would blame everything that occurred on Tom the Tinker. Now later on, as the rebellion kind of comes to a head, the burning of the Neville House occurs, and I'll get to that. David Bradford takes on more of a leadership role in that he didn't really like the violence, but he started to believe or started to think that maybe a show of resistance was the way that they could get their point across. And so I'll talk about that just here in a second. So some of the highlights of the rebellion, you do have the Tarn Feathering in 1791. You have the Tarn Feathering of Robert Johnson. There would be 3 other Tarn Featherings that would occur during the rebellion. Robert Johnson is the one I always like to point to because this guy is either the stupidest man that's ever lived or the bravest man that's ever lived, because he was tarred and feathered. Now, Tarn Feathering, you are stripped naked. You then have pine tar, hot pine tar, that a lot of times farmers would take sticks, wrap rags around them, dip them into the tar, and poke the tax collector in a sensitive place to punish him, to torture him. Then they would take the hot tar and pour it over their head and cover them in feathers. It wasn't boiling hot tar, but it was hot tar and it would burn. This man was tarred and feathered, survived. It was ridden out on a rail, survived, headed back out east, and then said in 1793, you know what? I think I'll go back out and be a tax collector again. He came back out, ended up being a tax collector again. And I just thought, wow, that guy is either brave or stupid. And I don't know which one it is, but you know what? All the credit to him. He didn't get tarred and feathered again. So, but there were 3 other times that you do see Tarn Featherings, and those go hand in hand with raising liberty poles, which was just a pole with a flag or ribbons on it, and it was a sign of protest. And there's a whole history behind liberty poles, which I think I did a laid-back history on liberty poles. So you could probably go back and check that one out. It's on our Facebook page, most likely. I think I did. Oh yeah, I did. Last year when we were supposed to have the Whiskey Rebellion Festival, I did that. Because I remember I didn't realize that the owners of the Liberty Pole Spirits, where I did the talk, were going back and forth behind me doing weird things. And it wasn't until afterwards where I watched it, I'm like, what are they doing? But yes. So the Battle of Bower Hill in July 16th and 17th, 1794, that was another major event. So 1791, 92, 93, you basically have protest. Now that protest, as I said, could be violent, like Tarn Featherings or raising liberty poles or stoning. But things kind of come to a head in 1794 in July of that year. Alexander Hamilton had sent out a marshal by the name of David Lennox to hand out writs to the farmers who were delinquent in paying their taxes. And those writs said they had to go to Philadelphia to face trial. Well, the farmers knew that earlier in the year that the government had passed a bill that said the farmers wouldn't have to go to Philadelphia, that they wouldn't have to travel any further than 50 miles to face trial in a federal court. So really, what Hamilton was saying was wrong, but it also wasn't, because there wasn't a federal court set up yet within 50 miles. So technically the farmers did still have to go back, but the wording made it a little bit tricky for the farmers to understand. And so they were mad. They end up attacking or shooting at David Lennox as he was attempting to hand a writ to William Miller. With Lennox was John Neville. General John Neville was the regional inspector for the excise tax, so the kind of the head tax collector in the area. And so on July 15th, they do fire at Lennox and Neville. They escape. The next day, the farmers, maybe about 30 of them, go to Neville's house wanting Lennox. They want to take Lennox into custody, but they also want Neville's tax records. So they go to Neville's house at Bower Hill, which is, if you guys know where Woodville Plantation is, the museum that's still there, that was John Neville's son's home. It sat across the road up on the hill from there. So that on July 16th, about 30 farmers go. With them is a gentleman by the name of Oliver Miller. When the farmers go to Neville's house, just to kind of make a longer story short, they demand that Lennox be sent out. They demand tax records. Lennox wasn't actually there, and Neville wasn't about to turn over his tax records. And so you end up having a small skirmish that takes place. Neville had actually armed his slaves to help protect the land. And a lot of people ask me, well, why would the slaves protect John Neville? Well, they know John Neville. They know what they're going to get from him. They don't know what the farmers are going to do. I mean, this is still their home. It's where they live. And so they're going to protect their home because they've been told that these farmers are going to come burn their homes. So they actually protected it. So they fired upon the farmers. The farmers fired back at thinking that Neville had fired on them. You have a small skirmish that takes place. And during the skirmish, Oliver Miller is shot. And he would later die. The following day, July 17th, the farmers go back to Neville's home. Now they want revenge for the blood spilt by Oliver Miller. They want to take Neville into custody for what he has done. Neville has left, though. He has an idea these farmers are going to be coming back, and so he leaves, takes his tax records with him. In his place is now Abraham Kirkpatrick, his brother-in-law. There are about 10 soldiers that are sent down from Fort Fayette to help protect the home. And so this day, the farmers come back with probably 150 to 200 men, I would say at most, and they end up attacking the home. And so on this particular day, July 17th, 1794, you have the first time that federal soldiers fire upon United States citizens. Because these aren't militiamen, these are federal soldiers, part of General Anthony Wayne's army. The farmers end up winning. Now, during the battle, their leader, Major McFarland, is wounded and he dies. The farmers end up winning. They allow the soldiers to escape, basically, to retreat. They end up burning the home down. They burn the outbuildings down. And so you have the Battle of Bower Hill. And it's at that point that the government decides they need to take action. Because the farmers are now causing more problems, because in August, early August of 1794, the farmers also march on Pittsburgh, threatening Pittsburgh because they feel Pittsburgh is not loyal to the rebellion. Ends up being where the people of Pittsburgh basically give them food and some whiskey, and everybody eats and drinks and they go home happy. They do accidentally burn down the barn of Abraham Kirkpatrick during the march, and to tell you how peaceful this ended up being, about 2 days later, there's an ad in the paper basically apologizing for burning down Kirkpatrick's barn and that they would make restitution for it. So, but again, come on, Pat. Everybody that's watching, I want you to know that's Pat Stavovi's phone that went off. But what it did was it showed how many men the farmers had. There's a good chance that there were 1,000 or more men that marched on Pittsburgh. And so now the government thinks there's a big army out here under the command of David Bradford, who is the guy that's on the horse in this particular painting. So you end up having the government finally deciding they need to send an army out to put down the rebellion. That army is commanded by George Washington, President George Washington. Still to this day, the only standing president to lead federal troops. He would be the first and only president to do that. The army moves west. They have about 13,000 men. Now, these are not federal soldiers. These are militiamen that they've called on from the state militias. Virginia, Pennsylvania, Maryland, Delaware. I'm missing one more. New Jersey. And so they've called on these militiamen to form into a federal militia under the command of George Washington, second in command Henry Lee, Light Horse Harry Lee, and then also Alexander Hamilton comes out as well. Major Hamilton comes out as well. Give you an idea, these federal militiamen, in one case, it really had to stink. And that is Pat's husband. I'm just kidding.
Our grandson is trying to reach us.
Oh, okay.
I turned the phone off and it's still
Just messing with you. It's no big deal.
Sorry.
Oh my gosh, I don't care. Listen, mine's probably still on, actually. My phone's sitting over there and it's probably still on. So I know it'll end up ringing and then I'll look like a fool too. Not that you look like a fool. That's not what I meant. That's not what I meant. So that is totally not what I meant. So, all right, let's get back on track. So instead of insulting people, I'll actually get back to the history. The federal militiamen, there were militiamen called in from Virginia, from the western counties, that had to go from Western Virginia, right below us, in Wheeling area also, had to travel east to Cumberland, meet up with the army, and then come back. So that really kind of stunk for them that they had to do that. But the federal militia moves west. They end up getting here in October of 1794. They first camp up near Mount Pleasant in a little town outside of there called Laurelville. They camp on the home of Judge John Lobinger. He was against drinking and alcohol, so he was for the excise tax. He allowed the federal army to camp there. And then also down the road a little bit, there was a gentleman by the name of Bonet. Unless you're in Westmoreland, then it's Bonnet. So Colonel Bonet, he had another piece of property where they camped on as well. And so from there, they then split and went out to capture some of the leaders of the rebellion. They wanted John Holcroft. They wanted David Bradford. And so Lee and Hamilton, because Washington turned over command in Bedford, PA on October 19th. He didn't see any reason that he needed to come the rest of the way, so he left the army in command of Lee. Lee and Hamilton take one branch and they come to Washington looking for David Bradford. And so you actually have Hamilton and Lee in the Bradford house looking for David Bradford. They personally go to the home looking for him. But David had already escaped. He had left about a week before that and headed out west to Ohio and then eventually down to Spanish West Florida, down to New Orleans. The army puts down the rebellion very easily. There's very little resistance. To wrap it up real quick, the farmers, there are several farmers that go back out to Philadelphia that face trial for treason. Most of the charges are dropped before they ever go to trial because there's no evidence against them. The 3 men that do go to trial and face trial for treason, they are found guilty. 2 of them are pardoned immediately. David Bradford is the only one that doesn't receive a pardon from George Washington. But in 1799, 5 years later, John Adams does pardon David. But he's down in Spanish West Florida, down in St. Francisville, so he's happy and doesn't need to come back. So now, after I just talked for 20 minutes when I said I'd be brief, let's get to the real talk. So, digging for the Whiskey Rebellion. Like I said, Diggers, this show from National Geographic with these 2 guys, love these guys, George Wyant and Tim Sayer. George and KG and Ringy are awesome guys. Still talk to them today. They're just incredible guys. They're so much fun. I think sometimes on the show people thought that they were a little dumb because they did crazy things, but that was what the director wanted them to do, was act like that. That was supposed to be the fun part of it. But KG and Ringy were amazingly knowledgeable. They were great. They had great minds for history and the objects they were finding. But they just had a good time doing it. They loved metal detecting. They just did it for fun together and then started making these videos that then got picked up into this TV show. So, as I said, we are going to be doing some stuff on the Whiskey Rebellion, but I wanted to make sure that we were being accurate when we did the detecting and the history side of it. And so we brought on Bryan. This is actually KG, and the gentleman in the middle is Mark Henshaw. He worked for Bryan as the on-site archaeologist. But it's kind of hard to, well, actually you can see it. See all those flags there? Give you an idea how we did this. They would go around and detect, and everything that they found would be marked. It would be flagged. Then the archaeologist would go over and he would look at what was found. He would catalog it, because KG and Ringy would dig it up. They would catalog it, and then they would GPS track where that object was found. And so when they got done with a site, every site they did ended up with a map like this. This is actually Bear Camp, or what we thought was Bear Camp, but was an outpost during Braddock's expedition. These are all the items we found on that site. In fact, if you zoom in more, there's even more than that. This is kind of an overview of it. But every one of those things we can pinpoint down to about a foot of where they were found. So it wasn't just a bunch of guys going and doing detecting, digging stuff up. We tracked and cataloged every site we went to. So that there is a historical record of it now. So if you want to go and see where a particular object was found, I can tell you exactly where that thing was found. We know the history of it. We know how deep it was in the ground. We know what type of soil it was in when it was found. So there's a complete record of every object that we found. And I say that I started saying that because I took some flack for being on this show, actually. I had people call me at the Historical Society when the show premiered, saying that they can't believe that I would actually work with these 2 idiots, and that I am not a true historian because I'm willing to work with them. And so I would, on behalf of National Geographic, I would call and I would explain to them exactly how we're doing everything, and they would say, oh, okay, well, never mind then. I had a guy, when we were doing the frontier forts, we found an object that was just absolutely amazing. We found a pewter musket ball. And I'm not going to go into why that's so rare, but it really is. And it was a pewter musket ball from the last battle of the American Revolution. Right here in Washington County, we found it. I had a guy call me and tell me after the show aired, that is not what it is. First off, I know musket balls. I'm the expert on musket balls in the United States, and I can tell you right now that's not what it is. And I can't believe you'd work with those two guys. You are not a real historian, and you're a joke just like they are. And so I was very calm. He had called National Geographic. He had called the production company. He had called Bryan, and Bryan ignored him. And so I had to deal with him. And so I called him back and I explained to him, told him everything that was going on. I said, I'll tell you what, we're going to take this musket ball and we're going to send it out for testing to see exactly what it is. I'll let you know. When it comes back, it's exactly what I said it was. It's a pewter musket ball. I call him, I explain it to him. And he goes, oh, I'm writing a new book on musket balls. Do you think it could be featured in the book? And I said, no, I don't think so. And I just hung up on him. So, but yeah, I just people, gotta love them. But, so what did we find? Where did we go? We went to two sites. We went to Judge John Lobiger's house, who I just talked about, that the Federal Army camped there, and we went to the home of John Holcroft. It's called the Cook Storer House because his home is not there anymore, even though we found his foundation while we were there of his home. The home isn't there. His daughter married a cook, gentleman by the name of Cook, and they built a stone house there, and that house is still there actually. So when we went to the John Holcroft house, this is some of the things that we found. But see that table right there? All those things? That's what we found. A lot of junk, a lot of iron, a lot of nails, a lot of just random pieces from barns and that kind of thing. A lot of tack that we would find, a lot of pieces of bridles and saddles. But then in all that, as we're detecting and sorting all that out, we did find some gems. And this one, for me, for whatever reason, was actually my favorite. And this is a United Mine Workers pin from, this one is from 1912. I know it says 1898, but that's when it was founded. But 1912, this one, no, 1902 actually is when this pin is from. And we found out that in 1902, the gentleman that was living in that house, and I'm drawing a blank what his name is right now, he was the representative from Washington County to the United Mine Workers Convention in Indianapolis. And this is his pin. This was his pin that he would have worn as a representative from Washington County. And so it was so neat to be able to tie. It wasn't Whiskey Rebellion, but it was something we could tie back to the house, to the property. Well, we also found this one. This one was from a little bit later. This one is, oh, I forget. This one is 1918, somewhere in there. But what's interesting about it is if you can see that 8, that is when they were fighting for the 8-hour days. So this was the pin from their national convention as well. That belonged to that same gentleman when he went. And this one, this was a local one. This convention was, I think, might have been actually in Pittsburgh. But yeah, so it was kind of, it was nice. We're finding objects that we know are related to the families in the home. Well, but we also found things that date to the time of the Whiskey Rebellion. This is a pewter button that we found. And this pewter button, because of the loop on the back of it, there's alpha and omega loops on the back. This one was an alpha that actually puts it back in the 1770s, 80s, or 90s, or even real early 1800s. But it goes back to the time of the Whiskey Rebellion. This is something we could say, I can't be sure, but I'd love to think that it fell off the coat of John Holcroft. That it was something that we could tie to him. But even though we can't say this is definitely Whiskey Rebellion, we're in the right time period. We're hitting the right time period now. And so we found a whole bunch of these buttons. Now we found some that were spun back buttons. We found ones that were cap, so 2 pieces that were put together. We found ones that were that had the London stamp on the back of them. But the majority of what we found when it came to the flat buttons fit that time period of the 1770s through 1790s. So the time when John Holcroft would have been there. So there's a really good chance. Now I can't say for certainty, but there's a really good chance we can tie these to John Holcroft, or at least his family or people that are working on the farm. So we found these wonderful buttons. we found a bunch of musket balls, round musket balls. Found those all over the place. We found all kind of different caliber of them, anywhere from 45 up through 69 caliber. So we found a huge variety of them, and I think is this the next one? No. Oh no, wrong one. Okay, I didn't put it in here, so let's go back. But a lot of musket balls that fit the time period. You know, they're the right caliber for that particular time period. So again, I can't necessarily say, yes, this is John Holcroft's musket ball, but there's a real good chance it's from the time of him being there. Then we also found this coin right here. Now, not this particular one, but we found a 1766 King George coin. And ironically, it was KG, King George, that's his nickname, that found this particular coin. So it was a, a Hibernia is what it was called, Spanish Hibernia coin. But 1766 was the date on it. Now this is a mint example of one. Here's the one that we found. So not quite as nice, but if you look, you can see the pattern here is there. So right in, let me get this is the lady that you saw with the harp on her back. So kind of, I'll go back up so you can see it one more time. So you can see the lady with the harp and then the crown on top. Well, there you go. This is sorry, let me find it. This is the crown right here, the lady here, and then the harp on the back. So, and it's 1766. So that was, at that time, the oldest coin that either of those guys had ever found. And so the Holcroft house ended up being just a wonderful site for artifacts that we were able to tie to that time period of the 1780s and 90s. Now, I'm showing you some of the nicest ones. Like I said, there's a lot of them in there that, you know, there's nothing to get too excited about, other than you can look at it, and when you start putting them all together, you start seeing the story of the farm. Now you're seeing a story. We see occupation at that site from the 1760s all the way up to the 1940s and 50s. So you're seeing a really constant occupation of that site. And so we want Whiskey Rebellion, but what we found instead was a nice history of the site that shows this permanent habitation of it. And then one of the things that I didn't put on there, and I'm not sure why I didn't, one of the other things we found on that site was a Canadian bank token from the 1830s. And it's called an unsu, and it means 1 cent. And this Canadian bank token, why would it be in Western Pennsylvania? Well, these tokens were minted by banks up in Canada, but they were made out of copper, so they still had value to them. They were backed by the very metal they were made out of, and they made their way down through the United States when people traded. Because I don't care what's stamped on the coin, what I care about is how much it weighs and what it's worth. And so you see these coins being traded throughout the United States. And what was interesting is that the following year after we found the one there, we were at the site of what we thought was Bear Camp, and Ringy, who found the unsu at Holcroft House, found another one. And he thought I was messing with him, because we got all the objects from the Holcroft house and from the Lobinger house. And so the Historical Society has them. He thought I brought it out and put it in the ground to mess with him. And I said, no, Ringy, I didn't. Same year, exact same year of the coin found on Braddock's Road because of the trade. So, but the Lobinger house, what did we find there? We found some wonderful things there. The lady, Mrs. Van Dyke, she was something. So when we were looking for these sites, when we were going to the sites to try to secure them for National Geographic, I had a broken leg. So I had this, I wouldn't wear a cast because I hate casts, but I had this huge boot that went all the way up to about mid-thigh, this big metal framework, and and I was hobbling around. And so Bryan and I go out together trying to secure these sites and talk to the landowners. We end up in Laurelville, and we were looking for the house, this big stone house. We know it's a stone house. And somehow we drove right by it and missed it. There were pine trees in the front of it, and we missed it. So we see a guy sitting on his porch. So we pull up, and I get out, and kind of say, hey, we're looking for this Lobinger house. Do you know where it is? And he just goes, it's right there. It was directly across the road, and we went, oh, okay. So right then, he probably thought we were idiots. And he said, I told him why we were there, and he said, well, you could go knock on the door, but Mrs. Van Dyke, she's in her 90s. She doesn't let anybody in, but you can at least try. So Bryan gets the right idea that I should be the one that goes because I have a broken leg, so I don't look as threatening. So I go over, he stays in the truck. I go over and I knock on the door, and this lady that was about yay tall, rail thin, comes to the door, and she is from, where was she from? She was from Germany. Yes, she was from Germany. Had the thickest accent I've ever heard. I talked to her for 45 minutes and I only got about 4 words out of her that I understood. But within about 2 minutes, she invites me into the home. And Bryan and the guy are sitting there like, what the hell? She invites me in the home. And she gave me a tour of her house. It was the most incredible thing. She was so nice. She took me all over the home. She's telling me the history, and I'm trying to catch what she's saying. And I'm trying to explain to her why I'm there. And she said, yeah, it'd be great. If you want to come back and film here, I would love that. And I explained that there was metal detecting. And I don't think she totally understood what we were going to do, but she said we could come back. The most amazing thing about being there with her is she smoked a cigarette the entire time I was there. And that's not, the most amazing thing was she never flicked the ash off. She smoked 1 cigarette walking through the house. We get back, she sits down, the whole ash is still hanging on. 90-some years old and her hands are that steady. Just amazing to me. And then she put the whole cigarette down. And I was enthralled walking through the house. I kept watching the cigarette thinking, that ash has got to fall off, right? It's going to go. It never did. So, wonderful lady. She was so nice. Fast forward 2 months. We're out here in Western Pennsylvania. We're filming. We're at the Holcroft house, and we decide we're done there. It's about midday. Let's go to the Lobinger house. So I call Mrs. Van Dyke. She has no idea what I'm talking about. She doesn't remember me. Luckily, there was a lady there that helped take care of her that remembered Mrs. Van Dyke telling her that day. And so she said, yes, come on over. And so I got there, and again, she was so nice once I got there. She was the sweetest thing. She invited everybody in to see the home, and so she was just wonderful. But we just had a great time there. I ended up totally not kind of off subject. I've got the gearworks at the Historical Society from one of Judge Lobinger's grist mills that was being used during the time of the Whiskey Rebellion because they were in her barn. And she was getting ready to maybe sell the home and didn't want them to just be thrown away and couldn't find anybody to take them. So 2 weeks after filming, I took a big trailer up there and loaded them up. She gave them to us. So I've got 18th century gearworks from a grist mill at the Historical Society. It's just the greatest thing. So I have no idea what I'll ever do with them, but I'm so happy we saved them. But back to the subject of what did we find. So Judge Lobinger's house, beautiful stone house, absolutely gorgeous stone house. One of the neatest features of the home is it was it's something you commonly see in Virginia, but not so much in Pennsylvania, is the family cemetery was walled in. It had a big stone wall around it. And so it was just so neat. It got cut out of the episode, but there's a great scene that was filmed of Ringy going in to the cemetery, putting his detector down, going into the cemetery and talking about Lobinger and the grave sites and stuff that was there. It was a great scene that unfortunately got cut. So, but they found some great things around that home. And these musket balls right here, these are musket balls. They are 62 caliber musket balls. Somebody's going to correct me because I think 62 is wrong. If Bryan is watching this tomorrow, which I guess is today if you're watching it tomorrow, he's probably sitting there thinking, that's the wrong caliber. But They are the proper caliber for a 1792 contract rifle. These are rifles that were contracted by the United States government that their army would use, that their military would use. Some of those contract rifles made their way out to southwestern Pennsylvania in the hands of these militiamen. And so these musket balls are the perfect size for those contract rifles. Can I say that's exactly what they are? Man, no, but it's a good chance. There's a really good chance that those came out here with these federal militiamen. Now, we also found, this one was really cool, and it's hard to tell what it is. That is a musket ball that's been hammered into a die because they played games with dice. And so this was hammered into a die because they would just take musket balls, they were lead, and they just hammer them into a square shape, carve the notches on them, and they would use them to play their games. So really good chance this came out with that military, that militia, and while they were camping, they were probably playing games, and this was dropped and left behind. And then we also have another musket ball, which is actually showing you the size for the contract rifles, which I believe was 62. A lot of buttons. Oh, that picture's horrible up there. I'm sorry, but that's a spun back button, which dates from the 1780s or 90s. The interesting thing about it is that if we go there, no. How do I go back? If we look at the other side of it, you have this. Now, this doesn't mean a whole lot when you look at it. It's just a rose button. But this means a lot if you do a little bit of research. Part of the militia that was called up was were men that were left over from the 1st Virginia Regiment that fought during the American Revolution. And their uniforms had those buttons on them. That exact button was on their uniform. And so when this militia was put together, the men wore the uniforms they had. They didn't get United States military uniforms. They wore what they had. So there were men from that regiment that were out here that probably had their uniforms on, and this button most likely fell off of it, got pulled off, fell off, dropped on the Lobinger farm, and stayed there for 200 years and waited for us to find it. So this ties directly to that regiment, which ties directly to that federal army. So we found the Whiskey Rebellion. This is what we've been waiting for, something that we could say definitely Whiskey Rebellion. And then we went a little bit further, and we found this coin, a 1794 large cent. The government minted their first coins in 1792, these large cents, and they're called Liberty large cents, flowing cap large cents, flowing hair large cents, because of Lady Liberty and how her hair was done, or what this cap is like. So flowing cap, because it's flowing off of her head. These were minted in early 1794, these particular ones in early 1794, I think February and March of 1794. When the federal militia was sent out here, they were sent with payroll to pay these men for their service. And I think there is an excellent chance that this coin was part of that payroll that was sent out here to pay the militiamen with. So this again is a mint example of it. Here's the actual one that we found. Still in excellent condition when you think about that it's been in the ground for 200 years, probably hit with a plow 4 or 5 times, turned over with the ground over and over again. So worn a little bit smooth. And it's kind of hard to see, probably up there especially, but right down there, it says, underneath there, it says 1794. Again, on screen here, it's a little bit rough to see, but it is a 1794 Lady Liberty large cent. So you can kind of see, we go back, her there, and then kind of see it. I wish I had held it the right way. So it was turned the right way, but you can see exactly, you can see the cap, right here. It's very easy to make out the cap. And so we know because of that cap and the date on the bottom that it could have only been 94, 95, and 96, but we could see the date on it. And Pat, I just want you to know my phone just went off. Luckily, I have it on vibrate, but I've
I tried to turn it off 3 times.
yeah.
It wouldn't turn off.
So my phone did. I felt it on my wrist, on my watch. So it did just go off. But luckily, I had mine on vibrate. So, but at any rate, so that's the coin that we found. So did we find the Whiskey Rebellion? I think so. I think with those musket balls, I think with that button especially, and with that coin, we found the Whiskey Rebellion. And I think we found, at the Holcroft house, we found John Holcroft. We may not have found the Whiskey Rebellion exactly, but we found John Holcroft. We found the time when he lived there. And so in essence, we did find the Whiskey Rebellion, and we were so excited about it. We think that it was a great episode. We actually went, I tried to get the Lobringer House designated a National Historic Landmark after these finds. I got turned down. They wanted me to redo it a little bit, and unfortunately I ran out of time and I haven't done it yet, but I want to redo the application. But it's really was a fabulous find for the show, and took off. The show took off after that, so we were really lucky for that to happen. So.